So here we have the beginning of American domestic policy from 1945 to the present. And a lot of stuff goes on here, so you're going to need to pay close attention here. And you may even need to do some extra little research with it to prep for the AP test. So we're going to compare and contrast the administrations of the various Democratic and Republican presidents in political and economic policies after World War II. And we'll begin with Harry Truman. His big domestic policy was known as the Fair Deal. It was kind of play on words, the New Deal. He did not do very much to help the labor unions, prohibiting closed shops, prohibiting political contributions. He permitted right-to-work states. He seized control of steel mills. But this was termed to be unconstitutional. While he was president, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 was passed. The 22nd Amendment was passed to prevent anybody from having more than 2 terms in office as kind of a response to FDR. It's interesting the Republican Congress passed this so that way they wouldn't have to deal with a Democratic president for 4 terms. What's kind of ironic about that is that the guy elected after Harry Truman probably would have been elected to a 3rd or 4th term, but could not. Probably one of the best things that Truman did in the domestic realm was to desegregate the federal government and the military. So in 1948, we're talking 20 years before the Civil Rights Movement, he desegregates the government and the military. And a lot of people push back against this, but he's the president, commander-in-chief, and he's the one who can decide what to do with the military and the government itself, at least the executive branches. He wins re-election in 1948. What's interesting about this is that you look at this picture here, he's holding up a newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. All throughout this campaign, people believe that Thomas Dewey would end up beating him. The way the polls closed in 1948, people thought that Thomas Dewey would defeat him. But when the election results came in, Harry Truman was the winner. It's not unlike what was happening with Donald Trump in 2016. However, people knew that Donald Trump was going to win before they went to bed. It's just before people started voting, everybody thought Hillary Clinton would win. And boy, were they wrong. Almost as wrong as everybody in America in the election of 1948. So Truman's Fair Deal. Again, it was a continuation of the New Deal style programs. He wanted to expand Social Security to include farmers and housewives. He wanted to increase the minimum wage and create some, federally subsidized housings. A lot of his stuff was prevented by the conservative coalition, but he was able to implement quite a bit of this stuff. In the election of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, who had been pretty coy about which party he would join, remember he was the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II in Europe, extremely popular, and right up until the election of 1952, he didn't really tell anybody whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. He ends up choosing to be a Republican and wins election pretty easily. Again, he was a 5-star general, a war hero. Everybody loved him, and he chose Richard Nixon as his vice president. What's interesting about Dwight Eisenhower is while he was a Republican, he was also very middle of the road. He didn't want to upset the thing too much. He did want to reduce the federal power. He was a believer in balanced budgets, was very much more pro-business than the Democrats, but he was more progressive as well. He's the one who said that it would be political suicide to try to get rid of Social Security. In fact, he said it was the third rail of American politics, and that term it's implied as like the subway. There are two rails that the cars are on, and then there's a third rail that has the electric power that powers the car. And if you touch the third rail, you die. And he said, if you touch Social Security, you die. He came up with the interstate highway system. He was a general, and he said that, we've got to make sure that we're ready in case we're invaded. So he creates this highway system. Everybody thought it was just for infrastructure to allow people to travel. But the reality is he wanted to be able to spread out his planes and his tanks and have them get from place to place a lot easier. So that was one of the major benefits of the highway system. He also got the National Defense Education Act passed. After Sputnik was launched, the United States realized that they were way behind in science and technology and those kind of academic disciplines. So he pumps millions and millions of dollars into education to get American children to start learning more and better. So one of the really great things that he did was to expand education to everyone. He was also pretty active in the civil rights movement, and we'll look at that later. So Dwight Eisenhower, a middle-of-the-road Republican, not a massive conservative, but definitely not a Democrat either. So here you can see the original interstate highway system. Most of it is in the east. Of course, that's where most of the population was in the 1950s. He wins re-election in 1956 pretty easily. The country is prosperous. They don't have many enemies. They're holding their own against the Soviets. Things are doing very well. But there is one worry. The president is extremely worried about the military-industrial complex. He's worried that senators and congressmen would be more beholding to the rich defense contractors rather than the voters. And, he's not entirely wrong. So the military and the defense contracts kind of work together to lobby Congress. And if you look at the defense budget, you can see that they're pretty successful at it. In 2015, we spent 56% of our budget on the military. Incidentally, the amount of money spent on foreign aid is 3%. The amount of money spent on science, like climate change and things like that, is 3%. So it's not like those are significant compared to military. What are they spending that money on? Well, having a modern military is pretty expensive. So there's two ways to look at this. Of course, he's not allowed to run for re-election in 1960 because the Republicans shot themselves in the foot there during Truman's term. So his vice president runs for election against a Catholic from the Northeast, from a family that not a lot of people liked very much at that time. But John F. Kennedy was very telegenic, and one of the big reasons why he won was because in the debate that was televised, he wore makeup, and he looked young and vibrant and youthful, and everybody loved him. And Nixon looked old and sick, and people didn't much care for him. So that's one of the really big reasons. So we start to see how appearances matter more than policies in politics. Really begins in 1960. So John F. Kennedy is elected in 1960, takes office in 1961. His program is known as the New Frontier. He wants, clean air, expansion of the welfare state, Social Security, things like that. But in his inaugural address, he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So he's saying, don't just stick your hand out expecting the government to take care of you. roll up your sleeves and help. During his administration, the 23rd Amendment is passed, which gives a little bit of a franchise to people who live in the District of Columbia. It's important to know that from, the 18th century and the 1700s, all the way up until 1960, people who lived in D.C. were not allowed to vote. He was also pretty instrumental in the freedom or the civil rights movement. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to the civil rights era in the 1960s. But not as much as his successor would. You can't talk about John F. Kennedy without talking about his assassination. On November 22nd, 1963, he is shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. The United States did a massive investigation into this and ruled with the Warren Commission that it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone that killed him. Now, there are conspiracy theories abounding everywhere about his assassination. And the people that I respect, the historians I respect that I've learned from and the reading that I've done, most of those are nonsense. The idea that the Cubans killed him, Donald Trump said that Ted Cruz's father was part of it. All that stuff is pretty crazy. Two things are possible. That the mafia was involved because he had some pretty shady dealings. Kennedy had some shady dealings with labor movements and things like that. But the one that I've read and I consider to be most plausible was that when Oswald started taking shots at the president, the Secret Service in the follow car panicked and accidentally shot Kennedy and killed him. So, of course, they're going to cover that up. And Lee Harvey Oswald never actually makes it to trial. He is assassinated by a man named Jack Ruby. And this is where the mafia thing comes into it. Jack Ruby had some ties to the Dallas Mafia. So it's one of those really sad, scary chapters in American history, but it's very interesting as well. LBJ takes over, and we see a massive expansion of social programs in America, but we also see the massive expansion of the Vietnam War as well. So Lyndon Johnson takes over in 1963 and runs for re-election in 1964. He wins very easily. His program is known as the Great Society, and there are programs in the Great Society that still extend to today. Big parts of it. I think some that most of you have to deal with are ETS, the Educational Talent Service. Many of you are part of that. The Gear Up program. Those all are things that came out of his Great Society. He also created Medicare and Medicaid, and I guarantee there's not many of you who don't know somebody who's on one of those programs. He was also a senator from Texas who was extremely happy to help the civil rights movement, which made him actually probably a better person for that job than Kennedy, considering Kennedy was from New England, and people in the South would not respect him telling them how to act when it came to African Americans. But a guy from Texas definitely had more credibility. So he wins election in 1964 against Johnson's Great Society. He called it a war on poverty, and poverty was a pretty major problem in America in the 1960s. So he wanted to solve that problem. And like I said, his biggest thing for that was the Great Society. So here's his war on poverty. He does this through civil rights legislation, immigration legislation, creates new housing, new education, Head Start, higher education, Medicare, Medicaid. He creates the Department of Transportation to create more safety. He also creates more environmental protection, promotes more culture with the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, and the public broadcasting system, two things that are in danger in the Trump budget. And also put in more consumer protection along the lines of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act when he created the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. So these are all big aspects of the Great Society, and many of them are still in effect today. During Johnson and Truman and Kennedy's administrations, we see the Chief Justice Earl Warren Court. And throughout this very activist court, we see rulings in favor of civil rights, in favor of rights of the accused. I think most of you guys will remember from government, Gideon versus Wainwright, and the Miranda versus Arizona cases. More cases dealing with the First Amendment and freedom of speech and privacy. So this is a very, very important court, and you need to know quite a bit of these cases. As I said during the foreign policy PowerPoint, Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968 because his approval rating was so low, lower even than Donald Trump's is right now, and he decides not to run for re-election in 1968. The Democrats are split, and as I said earlier, John F. Kennedy's brother was assassinated during the primaries. Otherwise, he may have run for the Democratic ticket and may have won the election because people still love the Kennedys. But Nixon wins following what is known as the Southern strategy to get more Southerners voting for Republicans. People did not trust the Democrats because of the Vietnam War. But there is one small minority party, the Party of the American Independence under George Wallace, who wanted to bring back segregation. Wallace was actually shot but not killed in 1968. He won a large part of the Southern bloc. But Nixon wins election pretty easily. He, however, does not get a majority of the popular vote, and that would kind of make him suffer there for a little bit in his first term. So we see the sixth party system during this time. This is when the parties kind of turn into what we know of them today. So if you look at Republicans on the left, a lot of their platform will be very familiar. These are kind of how the Republicans are today. And the same thing for the Democrats on the right. So all these different party systems that we've been through this year, this is where we are today, and it really begins in 1968. Richard Nixon wins election by appealing to the silent majority. Those people who were not protesting every day, were just going to work. They were veterans. They were just regular people, blue-collar people in rural America. They vote for him en masse. His plan is known as New Federalism. This guy is pretty interesting because when he's faced with a massive crisis like the energy crisis with the OPEC oil embargo, he does some things that are pretty democratic and not Republican in nature, like setting price and wage controls to prevent massive inflation and stagnation. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency, something that Republicans want to get rid of completely. But he's also dealing with massive protests throughout America. People who are not allowed to vote, even though they're being forced to go fight in Vietnam, ends up creating the 26th Amendment, which says that if you turn 18 years old, you can vote. Unfortunately for Nixon, the Watergate scandal happens, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And it forces his resignation in 1974, midway through his second term in office. The Warren Burger Court passes some more decisions that are kind of a mixed bag, but probably the most important one, or the one that will have the longest reaching consequence, is the Roe v. Wade decision, where they said that the government does not have the constitutional right to determine how women can use their bodies, or that women can get abortions. Nixon wins re-election in 1972 very easily. He runs against George McGovern. McGovern wins 17 electoral votes, 2 states, and that's it. Nixon wins, easily. People love him. But he starts to have some problems beginning in 1972. And that's the Watergate crisis. The Committee to Re-elect the President, which is ironically known as CREEP, sponsored a break-in of Nixon's enemies in the Democratic National Headquarters. Eventually, FBI agent Mark Felt, known as Deep Throat, would spill the beans about what's happening, and it's all over the newspapers and television. They try to cover it up. They're not successful. And Nixon is forced to resign in order to prevent impeachment by his own political allies and conviction by the Senate and kicked out of office. That is exactly what would have happened to him had he not resigned. But he agrees to resign on August 9th, 1974, and his vice president takes over. What's interesting about Nixon's vice president is that Gerald Ford was not even elected as vice president. In the election of 1972, Spiro Agnew was elected vice president, but because of a scandal, he had to resign, and Gerald Ford was put in there by the House of Representatives. So Gerald Ford has the distinction of being the only president who has never been elected to national office. He was a congressman before this and becomes president. One of the first things he does is to pardon Nixon, and really that kind of sealed the deal for him. He was never going to be reelected because people just didn't think that was right.